Good afternoon. Welcome to 21st Annual Central Southwest Asian Conference. What we're going to be doing actually, one announcement that Taylor Worm was one of the people who was going to be having the fourth person actually having presentation with us. So he's somehow kind of short notice that he's not feeling well, so I don't think he's going to show up. But we have three excellent presentations, impressive. They're going to impress you each for 20 minutes. They're going to talk. So they're going to be three back-to-back presentations. And no question will be taken between, no interruption, at the end of the third presentation. These are like case studies on Afghanistan, on Chechnya, on Egypt. And afterwards, we're going to be taking some questions, general question, macro question, or micro particular questions. But beforehand, since we have a little bit of time, since Taylor is not here, I thought to say a few words about Central Southwest Asian Studies that started at University of Montana 20-some years ago, almost like 30 years ago, shortly after the fall of Soviet Union in 1991. We started this, offering courses. I have to thank President Dennison, who actually was a major supporter for this particular first courses, then minor, then major, then a center, and also President Engstrom, at that time being provost, was also very much in support of what we were doing, actually traveling with us every 3-4 years. That we traveled like 7 times to different parts of the former Soviet states. We are dealing with 15 states, including Russia. In fact, after it was a time of President Bush, President George W. Bush, that 70 presidents of university from all around the country were invited to the White House. President Dennison came and to our center, shook hands, said that, "I'm proud of you guys." So what happened? He said that, well, I was invited to the White House, and President asked, "Any of you guys have been to Central Asia?" I was the only one who raised my hand. And everybody looked at me, "Oh my God, who is that guy?" And then at the end, everybody was rushing to me that, "How did you end up going to Central Asia?" I told them that they are a couple crazy guys who have started it right after the fall. They're traveling, and then I traveled with them. And now there are a bunch of us who travel together going there. And I was telling them about all different type of aspects of Central Asia that they had no idea where Central Asia was. And they think that it's part of Middle East or Near East. No. Central Asia, as I have seen it, is so different, although it has been interacting with China, with India, Near East, Middle East, Europe, but is a totally different entity. So briefly, we're going to go through a few slides and making a couple points, and then I'm going to be somehow referring this to our first speaker is going to be Aaron, that's going to be talking to us about a fascinating place. So part of it is that actually answering the question how back Central Asia actually goes through, and I know that you are all looking forward for the next event that I like to promote. That event also in the shadow of a war, that Professor Kia is there, that he has been always a great partner, a major contributor to this program, to this university. Each of us has taught thousands, over 10,000, probably 20,000 students for the last almost like 30 years, almost close to 30 years. I taught 7, 8, 9 courses per year in 2 different colleges, like we are talking about College of Art, and College of Humanities and Sciences. No sabbatical. What is sabbatical? No sabbatical. Wow. That's suicidal, isn't it? So now you're going to be talking about this. Probably if you have questions, next hour you can ask that how does it work out that when we have like 95% of the country against a party and still party continues its existence. This is, as you see, woman, life, freedom movement still going on. Thousands of people have been imprisoned by Hezbollah, Party of God, and still they are in power. That few couple million who runs it, and they're going to be talking about that the next hour. So, but then you see how massive these demonstrations are. So I thought to talk a little bit about my book that just came out a couple of years ago, Artistic Tradition of Inner Eurasian Culture, Prehistory, Ancient, Medieval, Golden Ages. Also, the kind of editorial review. This is a critical work that extends 21st century scholarship of Central Asia broadly and also integrates for the first time a macro-analysis of historical archaeology, art history, and an appreciation of cultural pluralism, accomplishments, and significance of inner Eurasian civilization too long ignored. So when we are talking about, you look up Central Southwest Asian Studies program or center, ding, you Google it, it says University of Montana. This is #1 in the country and has been the only one in the country that from the very beginning that so much time, money, and energy has gone into it. This is one of a kind. Now, number of books that was published, some of them by myself, some of them together with other scholars in the field. Now, something about Central Asia that is unique and very different from Middle East, Near East, China, India, is the fact that we are dealing with a gigantic openness called steppe. That is a Russian word, S-T-E-P-P-E. And primarily, we are talking about grazing land. Grazing land, that domestication of horse actually for the first time happens within this entity, 3,500 BCE. That is over 5,000 years ago. And so some of the cultures that they come, they're identified as horse cultures. And then also we have sheep cultures that when sheep, around the same time actually when sheep was domesticated, and we have like parties that since prehistoric time, they are dealing with horse, some of them dealing with sheep, and then we are also dealing with 2000 BC when chariot actually comes into existence in the heart of Eurasia, where we are talking about now. Central Asia, lately by European sources, are referred to Inner Eurasia. They refer to now because they have found out that many of their ancestors have come from this area. That DNA shows that. So now one thing about, like we are talking about, we are jumping, like going fast ahead of time, but here is one of the centers of metalworks that they think now for sure Central Asia was the very first time that metallurgy actually comes into existence. Now they are sitting in Sakos. This is the name of some of these nomad tribes. And what it shows, this is from 700 BC, a gold piece, fascinating as far as work that you see here. Now Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg has 20,000 of these pieces, believe it or not. The second floor of Hermitage Museum, you have to give your name. They said, okay, we get in touch with you. It takes a few days to check that you don't have any records of any kind or sort. And then somebody armed is walking with you when you are watching, when you are looking at some of these pieces. Now, what is the significance of these pieces? For the first time, these are two Scythian soccer warriors chatting, talking to each other. We are dealing with discovery or invention of boots and pants, trousers, that after a few hundred years, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, said that you see these guys that in the plains, they wear these type of things. We have to change the uniform of our armed forces to pants and boots so we be able to somehow ride the horses much better. So when we are talking about some of these discoveries. Now, we are talking about a totally decentralized type of entity that is led and ruled by king and queen and warriors around them. When we are talking about horse culture, you see even the images of horses on their crowns or their hats. The one that you see to the right-hand side was discovered. It's called Gold Man. It was discovered by Akhyshev. Akhyshev is the most famous Kazakh archaeologist in 1967. He found it in a kurgan. Kurgan in Russian meaning mound, meaning that they are mound builders. They are like we find the funerary site of some of these kings and queens in those mounds. So 4,000 pieces of gold woven together in one piece. And then when we are looking to the left-hand side, your left-hand side primarily is a queen that Natalie Polesnik, a couple of years after the fall of Soviet Union, 1993, 1994, she found that in ice, and this is like the cover page of the National Geography. Now, for the first time, we are dealing with tattoos that comes into existence within prehistoric time in Pazyryk in Central Asia. Now, these are Tian Shan Mountains in Xinjiang province. I don't want to take too much of time, maybe a couple more minutes, and I'm going to be stopping. Still, we are talking about horse culture, sheep cultures, and then when we are talking about Central Asia, primarily dealing with Tian Shan Mountains, Kunlun Mountains, as you see them to the southern part of the Pamir, Hindu Kush, Himalayas. And now some of you guys have taken 241 for fall. That's what we're going to be talking about. And then it is primarily within this particular segment of time when we are talking about 6th century BC, 5th century BC, that for the first time these Khwarezmia, Margiana, Sogdiana, Parthia, Bactria, these are the states of the first empire that is somehow expanded into this area to southern Central Asia, and that is Achaemenid Empire we are talking about. So I think that the next, I'm going to stop here. I was going to talk about the way that this the colonial forces move into this area, but you see where colonial forces are. This is someone from Central Asia surrounded by two friends. Save me from my friends. The bear is Russia, the lion or the kitty cat is England. So the two on two sides, and now we're going to be talking a little bit about the devastation of the area, occupation of the area. I was not supposed to talk, but then sorry that I take a few minutes because Taylor is not here. I thought talk a little bit about that. So you want to move here, please? Welcome, Aaron.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just that a little bit. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Professors Meridad Kia and Ardashir Kia and everyone involved putting on this program this year. So I'll go ahead and give them a quick round of applause real quick. To kind of pick up where Professor Kia left off a moment ago, I would like to discuss the Afghanistan, the First Anglo-Afghan War. So, Afghanistan is located in a very unique part of the world. In its original creation, it never should have became a piece of land, a country, an independent state. But its creation came about from the what's referred to as the Great Game. But before we get into that, little brief tidbits about its history. It's an old and ancient land, conquered originally, sort of, by Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenids in the 6th century BC, and is split between the satrapies, or the states, of Bactria, Sogdia, Gandhara, and the Parthians. Alexander the Great later came through the same area and brought the Hellenistic era, and later the creation of the Greco-Bactria kingdom, several years later, located around the area of Herat. And the Mongol hordes came, brought the fall of the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219 AD, and saw mass immigration to the Levant, Anatolia, and the Near East. So, why was it created? Well, as the picture shown before between the bear, the Central Asian, and the lion was the Great Game. The Great Game was a constant clash between these two giants of the world, with the British on one side coming from India and the Russians coming from Persia and Central Asia. This land has a wonderful and well-earned nickname known as the Graveyard of Empires. And these two large world powers got to feel firsthand about how that nickname became a thing. For the British, it was in the cases of the Anglo-Afghan Wars, and for the Russians, the Soviet-Afghan War. But why is this land so hard to conquer? The ethnic clashes and the class issues that make this area very unique is one of the main reasons why it's never fully unified and always in constant turmoil. These particular groups, that of this chart right here, shows, and these are not accurate percentages, they're because of the mass migration of people moving over the past few years. These percentages are not quite accurate, but the ones for this presentation to keep in mind are the larger ones, such as in the case of the Pashtuns, which are a tribal Persian group of people, very traditional. And then you have the Tajiks, which speak the Dari dialect, who make up the bureaucracy. They are non-tribal. And then you have the Uzbeks and the Turkmen in the orange and the red up there that also come into play in many of the events that happened in the First Anglo-Afghan War. Some notable figures here. We have Alexander Burns, Lord George Eden, Earl of Auckland, Shah Shuja, and Dost Muhammad. Before the war, the leading factors that kind of led to the conflict happening was the British and the Russian involvement in the Persian courts wound up falling through, and the Russians gained favor over the British, now seeing that the Russians now had access to a warm water port and were a little bit closer to getting into India. And then when this became more prevalent as an issue, the Viceroy, Lord Eden, he sent Alexander Burns in 1837 to Kabul to meet with the king at the time, Dost Muhammad, and they began negotiations, and they found a common ground, meeting negotiations where Dost Muhammad would gain Jalalabad and would also receive concessions from the British to create sort of a buffer region that came to an end when Jalalabad belonged to Ranjit Singh, the Maharaja, which I always pronounce incorrectly. And he was not willing to betray the Sikhs and give Jalalabad to Dost Muhammad and his kingdom, and so then brought about the last nail in the coffin, which was here in a moment I'll show you, but their main goals were to kind of replace Dost Muhammad with a puppet monarch, to create this buffer region, which is very mountainous on one side and very mountainous on the other, and to create economic rather than militaristic negotiations between the tribes and the British so they can have an access of trade and movement of forces in and out of the area. So here's a map showing many of the areas that I will be discussing, such as Herat, Kandahar, Jalalabad, Kabul. The last nail in the coffin, of course, in 1837, 30,000 Persian forces led by Muhammad Qajar Shah himself, the king of the Qajar dynasty in Persia at the time, led by a Russian regiment by Count Simonok, invaded, essentially, and laid siege to the city of Herat. This was a failed attempt, but it made the British really worried, and so they gathered up the army of the Indus, seeing 21,200 soldiers of British and Indian contingents, as well as 36,000 Indian servants and 30,000 camels being used to invade in early 1839. The initial campaign kind of went off with very little resistance. The city of Quetta saw little to no fighting whatsoever, and they sent in Shah Shuja, who was the grandson of the former king that Dost Muhammad overthrew in 1826, as he led an army of 3,000 horsemen into the city and was greeted by applause, cheers, and the roars of the crowds. And they later figured out, the Afghan population, that these were all foreigners that were behind him. They were not Afghans themselves. They weren't Pashtuns, Tajiks, or anything of the like. The city of Ghazni saw cannon fire and a few small skirmishes as the army moved forward, later retreated, and small skirmishes along the roads to Kabul. And then when they got to the city of Kabul, the Bala Hasar, which is the palace fortress that the king was living in, which this is one of the last pictures of it before it was destroyed in 1919 due to British air raids during the Third Anglo-Afghan War. Dost Muhammad fled shortly thereafter, and as the army was coming into Kabul, he reemerged later that year, gathering a new army of Turkmen and Uzbeks as he gained an ally in the north, the Wali of Halum, essentially the mayor of the city, granted him this army of 5,000 horsemen and met on the battlefield. Heavy casualties on both sides, and Dost Muhammad later fled when the battle was not going his way. British cavalry almost caught up to him and arrested him. He later came back with another army and fought 5 columns of British-led native Afghan soldiers who later broke the lines, and it was only the 5 British officers who were leading the charge that continued the charge. 3 of them were wounded and 2 of them died. Dost Muhammad eventually surrendered to Sir William McNaught, the envoy of Kabul, assigned by the viceroy at the time, Lord George Eden. There was a brief period of calm where General Nott went to Kandahar because they were having issues with the Pashtun tribes down there, causing resistance. And General Sal returned to Jalalabad through the pass shortly after the death of Ranjit Singh. There was resistance from excuse me for a moment, the population there in that kingdom. And and uprises began, and so the army was sent back to quell the resistance. Several grave mistakes that led to the second half of the war that saw the British defeat was the British and Shah Shuja's failed diplomacy. The British and Shah Shuja's government in Afghanistan failed to continue the flow of money to the Pashtun tribes, no longer securing the few passes between the large mountain ranges for safe travel. In 1840, they tried to buy the alliance of the Vizier of Herat in western Afghanistan, kind of ruining their reputation there. The increased political and economic struggles saw that the inflation rate reached 5,000%, as this traditional government created by Shah Shuja and the British was not well built enough to be enforced on a very impoverished and very backward region of the world, where these policies could not be adapted and used. When General Sal sent his forces, as well as a vanguard, through the Horud Kabul Pass between Kabul and Jalalabad, the 35th Native Regiment was ambushed on all sides by the Ghilzai tribesmen, and they were hiding and using the terrain to their advantage, where a few men could hold off an army of a few thousand, using the landscape to their advantage, seeing massive casualties and death as they were progressing through the pass. In Kabul, at the time, the Afghans took to the streets, attacked the British residency and the British quarter, seeing hundreds killed in the streets. Alexander Byrne, who was the diplomat, was killed in said incident. The British were then forced to vacate to the cantonment, which was the military fort compound outside the city. Here we have... Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button. That's why. There we go. Fighting Bob, General Robert Sal, and Sir William McNaught. The winter of 1841 essentially brought the end to this series of events. Besieged and desperate, the cantonment was under intense siege. That was getting larger and larger by the day. Sir MacNaughton sent correspondence to General Sal to return to Kabul, as well as to General Nott to send forces to reinforce, retake the city, and reestablish their rule. General Sal was not willing to send forces as he suffered so many casualties on the way to Jalalabad, and General Nott was so far into his campaign that he was not available to regroup enough in time to aid and take the city. The tide changed. November 22nd, 1841, when Akbar Khan, the son of Dost Muhammad, rode through Kabul at the head of a horseman army of 6,000. Several skirmishes occurred, seeing tremendous losses on both sides. This caused MacNaughton to negotiate a peace treaty. There we go. Several different proposals were made between the two sides. When the two parties met to ratify the treaty, MacNaughton and 3 other officers were grabbed by Ghazis, which are Islamic holy warriors, and murdered. After the death of MacNaughton, the British were forced to do a death march from Kabul back to India in the January of 1842. The death march through the same pass that General Sal went through months earlier saw a bloodbath that ensued of constant raids happening to the fleeing British. As the British moved through the Horud Kabul Pass, the British suffered an estimated 3,000 casualties. Some reports say that there was as much as 10,000. Akbar Khan offered to General Elphinstone to lay down their arms and be taken hostage, and they will survive. The general declined, and as the march continued through the pass, the bodies just kept piling up. Here we have a painting labeled the winter of 1842, showing the death of General Elphinstone and the British and Indians returning from Afghanistan back to India. Here we can see the advantages that the tribesmen took, using the terrain to their advantage, using the cliffs and the terrain to benefit and rain down fire on their enemies. The survivors, it is Kind of unclear how many survived, but we know for sure that Dr. Bryden, who was a general surgeon for the East India Company, was the only survivor to arrive at General Sal's fort in Jalalabad. He was shot 3 times, and his horse died in the stable from its wounds days later after arriving at General Sal's fort. The returning army that came later that spring was General Sal's regrouped army. They took the garrisons at Kandahar, resecured Jalalabad in September, and reinforced by Indian armies there. British forces made their way to Kabul and freed the prisoners taken captive the year prior. Anglo-Afghan relations after the return of the British forces ended any cooperation between the parties. Sentiment and distrust towards one another would increase through the years, seeing more and more conflicts throughout the reigns of the emirs thereafter, after the death of Dost Muhammad in 1856, and all the way through the First World War, and then even after that. Some concluding notes. This war affected not just the relations at the time, but also through the next few hundred years, as the presidents of Afghanistan, after we entered in 2001, were members of the tribes that aligned themselves with the British and were essentially chosen to rule as they were allies with the British at the time. Thank you.
Better. Okay, that's better. Perfect. So my presentation is going to be going a bit to the west of what Aaron did. And my title of the presentation is Fathers and Sons, Islam and Imperialism in Chechnya. Now, some geography is important here. Chechnya is kind of the northern region of the Caucasus, which is defined by being in between the Caspian and Black Seas, and is kind of it's where Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan are, and Chechnya is way up in the north of that, as you see here. And so Chechnya is the one we'll be talking about now, and Dagestan is also equally important. It's kind of like a sister republic to Chechnya, and both of them are in Russia currently. And Chechen society way back when we were talking about this, was largely tribal and egalitarian. They were clan-based. It's kind of like a elected monarchy where there was there were multiple leaders of Chechnya, but it was kind of based on which family you happened to be born into. And for the religion, the West Caucasians, include the Dagestanis and the Chechens, were largely animist at this point. They had a brief flirtation with Byzantine Christianity, but that really didn't work because it was too arcane and convoluted for them. When Constantinople became Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire converted them to Sunni Islam. And the particular flavor of Sunni Islam is the Sufi Brotherhood. Now, what is a Sufi? A Sufi can be described largely as Islamic mysticism. It's driven by a fear of the Day of Judgment and a need to commune with the divine reality of God before that happens. And as you see here, the dancers, there's a very particular kind of religious dance that they do, which is almost oxymoronic for most Muslims. But the particular strain of Sufism that is prevalent in Chechnya is the Naqshbandi strain. It was from Persia, I believe, and there were 2 people before the main person, but the one who essentially started the Naqshbandi strain was Baha'u'llah al-Naqshband, who was an interior designer, I believe. And he has a list of 11 requirements. The most interesting one for me was solitude in the crowd, which is basically a version of internal monasticism, where you have a wife and you dance and you eat and you drink and interact with daily life, but in your heart you are reminding yourself constantly with the majesty of God and are keeping yourself consciously separate from everyone. You are engaging with life, but reminding yourself of your holy mission within. And kind of the reason why Naqshbandi Sufism and Sufism in general penetrated in the kind of wilder areas of Chechnya is it's very political and it's very flexible. Sufi leaders kind of by default end up being political leaders, and they could deal with the Chechens' kind of issues. One would say they drink, they dance, they will not give any of those up, so having Sufism is more flexible for them. And it leads us to the first of the father-son pairs. This one is not biological and more spiritual. Sheikh Mansour, born in Aldi, which is a very small town in what is now Chechnya in the 1760s, we don't exactly know when, as Ushurma, and he was a Uzden. His family was Uzden, which is essentially a free peasant, one step above serfs, so not slaves, but not anywhere close to being relevant. No formal education. He was just a sheep herder. He would likely have been a sheep herder until he died, until he woke up to the divine truth, where apparently he was up in the mountains around like 16, 17 years old, and Muhammad came down in a cloud, the Prophet of Islam came down in a cloud, and said to him that the Chechens had fallen away from the true path of Islam. They were drinking, they were dancing, they had all their blood feuds, they were uncivilized, and you, Ushurma, are the ones who will lead them to my true path of Islam. And apparently he went straight back to his house, locked himself in, and fasted for 3 days straight to kind of prepare himself, I guess. And then when he came back out, he ordered everyone to abandon their blood feuds and abandon their drinking, and he was proclaimed an imam in 1783. And an imam is essentially, I think it literally means teacher, but it's basically like an Islamic learned man. And took the name Mansour, which means victorious. And obviously you can't just claim you are a prophet and have everyone believe you, so people asked him to prove it, and then 2 giant earthquakes hit Chechnya in February and March of 1785, and everyone got really scared and thought that he was the prophet, or a prophet at least. And like every good prophet does, he promised and did miracles. A visit to him later when war started across Russian lines counts as a pilgrimage to Mecca by God, and Mecca is the city in which the Kaaba, the black cube, is in, and that's arguably the single most important Islamic rite, so just proclaim that seeing me in person equals this is one of the most heretical things you could possibly do. He supposedly could bilocate, or it could be in 2 locations at once. He could prophesize things. He once prayed on water, apparently put out the carpet on a pond and just prayed there. And this led to an ever-increasing politicization of Islam. Sharia, which is the Islamic law, was a necessity for winning the war against the Russians in the political sphere. In so doing, he tried to convert the Christian Ossets and the pagan Ingush, which at the time Catherine the Great in Russia was trying to do the exact same thing. Didn't want anyone intruding on her turf, and launched a punitive expedition in 1785 to Aldi with 3,000 soldiers to capture Mansour. And Mansour knew the terrain really well, so when the Russians came, they found the town abandoned, the circle behind them, crushed them. I think like half of them died and the other half left. So miracle victory, and Mansour decided to engage in some army building, got some ties from mosques and households, and got 12,000 men by the end of July, which is a huge force, especially if they're all guerrillas. But turns out if you don't know the terrain and can't disappear into the mountains, your miracles tend to dry up. He raided a town of Kizlyar in 1785, in August 1785, which failed, terrible blow to legitimacy. If you claim that all of your victories come from God and then you fail, either you're wrong or God's wrong, and you're not really going to win that argument. Mansour's kind of coalition fell apart. He hid in the Ottoman kind of border city of Anapa, which fell to the Russians in 1791, and Mansour was basically locked in a room in St. Petersburg until he died in 1794. And so enters Sheikh Shamil, born in 1797 in Dagestan, which, as you remember, is kind of to the side of Chechnya. And he had a similar background where Muhammad came to him and told him that I needed to send them all to the true path. There's an anecdote, which I believe is true, that upon receiving these visions, he walked out, saw his father drinking, and beat him half to death with his bare hands in broad daylight. And then everyone applauded, seeing that he was such a fanatical enforcer of the Sharia, that he was what the Chechens and the Dagestanis needed. He consolidated his forces by 1836 and was elected imam by affirmation in 1834. He apparently refused it 3 times in a row so as to make sure they were really sure about him leading them. And he decided to go to war. The Russians were nervous after Mansour of having another prophet, so they took the town of Zandak in 1836 to Khao Shamil, which had the only effect of unifying literally every Dagestani against the Russians and with Shamil. Funny how that works. The siege of Talik was messy, kind of by anyone's standards. Shamil ended up losing, but he phrased the surrender in such a way as to apply equality between the great emperor Nicholas I and the great leader Sheikh Shamil, as opposed to the great emperor and just some rando in the forest. Nicholas was being lied to by his advisors. He was the Tsar of Russia at the time. Was being lied to by his advisors very, very heavily. Wanted to see Shamil. Shamil refused, said his friends would kill him if he did. And then Nicholas made it a personal point to have his head on a platter. Shamil retreated to the mountain fortress of Akugol, which was besieged for 80 days. On August 21st, 1836, there was an invasion. I think Shamil was one of 3 people who survived that. Literally everyone else in the entire fortress died. And Shamil survived by cowardice and luck, but managed to make that work for him. He fled to Chechnya, started enforcing Sharia again, and then claimed that his embarrassing retreat was actually God sparing him personally, and managed to bootstrap himself into taking over the majority of Chechnya by 1840 and established the Imamate of Chechnya in 1844, which was the first kind of unified law code and citizenship laws of Chechnya at the time. It was very draconian, but also surprisingly egalitarian. Funnily enough, religious minorities, especially Jews, would travel from Orthodox Russia to the Imamate of Chechnya because they were treated better under the super harsh Muslim dictatorship than they were under the Orthodox umbrella of Nicholas, which was fascinating to me. But this kind of religious state really only works as long as Shamil's winning. And by 46, the Russians had lost patience. They started burning down all the forests in Chechnya because you can't hide if there's no forest to hide in. Shamil lost the popular support of the people because they started losing, and then God's support left, and then their homes were getting burned down. And the Crimean War had the opposite effect on them that it did on everyone else. Everyone else in Europe saw the Crimean War as an embarrassing failure for the Russians, but the Chechens saw the Crimean War in 1856, I believe, as the Russians kind of shaking off the rust and finally getting serious. And in the town of Gunib in 1859, Shamil was with his family, like 6 people, and he tried to seek death as a glorious martyr, but his son talked him out of it. Funnily enough, he was treated with greater respect when he was captured than Mansour was. He was actually allowed to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca and died in Medina, the second holiest city in Islam. And the legacy of Mansour and Shamil was kind of a civilizing effect. There were no more blood feuds. It's the first experience with actual state. And it was actually a role model for the entire area, the entire tribal population. And the legacy is kind of has some more concrete things as well. This is the Chechen battalion named after Sheikh Mansour, which is fighting in the Ukraine war on the side of the Ukrainians, which I'm sure Mansour would appreciate. And then this is a plaque in Kyiv, because Shamil actually stayed there from 1868 to 1869, and it says something to the effect of, here he was in 1868 to 69. His life was the foundation of friendship between the Ukrainian and the Dagestani people. National hero of the Dagestanis, Shamil. And I think he would have really appreciated that as well. What he would not have appreciated is these two, Akhmat Kadyrov and Ramzan Kadyrov. Akhmat's picture was taken in 2003, and Ramzan's was taken in 2023. And the situation in Chechnya in between the mid-19th century and the later 20th century was not great. The Nazis somehow managed to dig up Shamil's grandson and wanted him to make the population rise up in holy war against the Russians, which There were some that did, but most of them hated the Nazis more. They just wanted them out. But Stalin, as you might imagine, took that well, had Beria, his intelligence agent, round up literally every single Chechen in the entire area, put them in cattle cars, and ship them off to Central Asia in 1943. This is just absolute textbook ethnic cleansing. No one talks about it ever. Very fascinating stuff. One of these people who got cleansed was Zhokhar Dudayev. He was a major general of the Air Force of the Soviets. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, he abandoned his family, his just entire life, and went to Chechnya immediately to become the first president of Ichkeria, which was the independent, hopefully, Chechen state, and so led the first Chechen War from 1994 to 1996. And the popular imagination is that it was just a terrorist nightmare, but it's actually surprisingly clean, at least for most of them. Yeltsin, the president of Russia at the time, got a ceasefire in 96 and a peace treaty in 97, which implies if the Chechens didn't win per se, they were at least not losing. And so enters Akhmat Kadyrov. He had no pious backstory. Muhammad certainly isn't going to talk to him, of all people. He was born August 23rd, 1951 in Karaganda, the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, after his family got deported there. He returned with his family in 1957 and became kind of a religious authority. He was granted the position of Mufti of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria in 1995, and the Mufti is essentially the jurist of Islam. If you have questions on Islamic law, he's the one you go to, the final authority in Chechnya anyway. And kind of his defining characteristic is he hated Wahhabism. Wahhabism is a Saudi sect of Islam, and it's essentially the hyper-conservative one step below being an actual terrorist. No Muslims really like the Wahhabists, except for the Saudis. Dudayev got killed by the Russians in 1996. He was taking a phone call. The Russians triangulated it and hit him with an airstrike. And that left a giant gaping hole where the leader of the Chechen Wars was. And Akhmat was super, super scared of the Wahhabis swooping in and turning it into a holy war, which he hated. And so he decided to turn his coat. He switched sides in 2000. He was still the Mufti, but now the Russians installed him as the governor of Chechnya, which they loved because they had a convenient mouthpiece for them to do things without the rest of the world getting in their business. He was fully consolidated in 2002, kind of towards the beginning of the Second Chechen War. He became the only judicial authority in the entire Chechen Republic. All separatists had the choice to either join him or they could die screaming. His primary weapon was abduction. You would come home and your wife just disappeared, you would disappear, everyone would disappear, and you either come back finding his side or you wouldn't come back at all. It was a culture of fear that just broke the back of Chechen solidarity, because it was initially with Shamil and Mansour's, it was us against them, but now it was everyone against everyone, and that, I think, caused more damage than anything he did physically. And the brutality allowed a convenient smokescreen for Putin, because if Chechens are brutally killing other Chechens, then who cares? It's eternal matter. But if Putin does it, then the U.S. gets a little huffy about that. Turns out the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Ramzan Kadyrov in 1976, Akhmat Yurat Chechnya, was kind of his father's hatchet man for a lot of what he did. He was the chauffeur first, the bodyguard second, and the militia leader of the security service of Akhmat Kadyrov, or the Kadyrovtsi, which they were the ones doing the kidnapping and torturing of everyone, and Ramzan was personally involved in a lot of that. He was the one personally killing people, torturing people, all of that. And he had a reputation akin to the Gestapo or the NKVD, which were the Nazi, German, and Soviet intelligence agencies, which were just the horrible ones. And unfortunately for everyone, Ramzan managed to take over. Akhmat was not incredibly well liked by the separatists, so he got blown up in the Dynamo Stadium in Grozny, which is the capital, in May 9, 2004. The same day, Putin invited Ramzan over to the Kremlin, which I find interesting. He must have been really scared to invite someone invite Ramzan to the Kremlin before his father's corpse was cold. And Ramzan became the vice premier of Chechnya, which is essentially, he was too young to be the president. He was like 29 at that point, so they installed like a puppet to the president. He was just the vice president. He was running everything. And now enter the utopia. Kadyrov is the absolute star of the show here. The best comparison I could find is Ivan Grozny or Ivan the Terrible on TV. Combines a classic Russian strongman with a super new, hip, technocratic idea. He's treated like a genie where if you get his attention, he will reward you, but only reward you in ways he deems fit. He's a super masculine standard, flaunts his wealth obscenely. You can see in these pictures, that's him with a whole bunch of guns and a giant golden machine gun. That's him with a poor Caspian tiger on a leash, which he looks super scared, both him and the tiger, so I don't know how that works. And then some pictures. The Second Chechen War started in '98, I believe, and kind of fizzled out in terrorism in 2008. And this is Grozny in 2000, just absolute bomb-leveled, shelled out. And this is the utopia. That picture's not CG, it's real color, it's legit. From 2000 to 2020. So Ramzan managed to rebuild stuff. Of course, he'll say it's all him, but it's really just Putin shelving in money to make sure that embarrassing failure didn't happen again. Kadyrov, as a Muslim, he's not officially Mufti, but he sure acts like it. Extremely politicized. He checks every imam in the region and personally boots them out if they don't toe the line. He really hates Wahhabism. He won't even read directly from the Quran because that smacks too hard of fundamentalism. But the thing he cares about is not really the Islamic minutiae, it's just the sense of belonging. And of course, belonging means doing what he says, but he kind of co-opts Islam for a Chechen community, conflates their values with his values. But it's really the only game in town. You could either join him or it could do what a lot of Chechens did, go join ISIS, which is unpleasant. And some similarities between the two as a final concluding thing. They both had intense politicization of Islam, made themselves and Islam the weapon of the state. They create a lot of false dichotomies. Either you were a true Muslim or you're with the Russian imperialists. Either you were a Chechen Muslim under Kadyrov or you're fighting with ISIS in Syria. And no one wants to do either of those things, so they had a lot of support by default. Both are super autocratic, but the difference is the sheiks were relatively well liked because they were fighting against oppressors, and you can forgive a lot of dictatorial views if you're fighting for a good cause. But the Kadyrovs joined their oppressors. It's kind of the age-old Russian contract of trading freedom for security. If your life is relatively safe, then you could be a terrible dictator, but it doesn't really affect you. So, yeah, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you, both Mehrdad and Ardi Kia, for welcoming me and for hosting the conference. Today, I'm going to be talking about the assassination of Anwar Sadat in Egypt in 1981. I'm mainly going to be discussing the European colonialism and imperialism in Egypt that led to the birth and rise of political Islam and radical Islamism as a whole, and the post-colonial leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat, and really what the assassination means for the modern world. So a map here, this is really where we're dealing with, you can see Egypt and Israel right there. The UK, France, and India are very important as well. So the colonial and imperial legacy, I included two very important years on here, 1798 and 1882. 1798 is when Napoleon Bonaparte would invade Egypt in his global conquest. Napoleon's invasion was really a way to extend his power over the globe, obviously, and he really wanted to end Ottoman superiority in the region. When he invaded, he effectively eliminated the leadership of the Mamluks, who were leadership of ex-slave soldiers, effectively. But Napoleon would only last in Egypt for about 4 years. He ended up evacuating due to the tumultuous political situation in France. And this created a power vacuum that would end up being filled by Muhammad Ali in 1802. Ali was a member of the Ottoman Expeditionary Forces, and he was a really ruthless leader. He massacred the Mamluks. He nationalized all agricultural land under the state. And he really wanted to modernize and westernize Egypt and make another great empire. And he did that quite a bit, actually. He expanded trade, and he brought in a lot of Western goods and services. He also brought in a Western education system, which is very important because it started to build more of the intellectual character of Egypt and Cairo at the time. And he would ultimately be succeeded by his son Ismail, who would continue this modernization and westernization. Ismail would go on to fund the building of the Suez Canal and the establishment of the Suez Canal Company. He did a lot more heavy investment in education and building of structures for this. But all of this funding was really from foreign loans and sunk Egypt deep into debt. And this kind of forced Ismail to sell all of Egypt's stocks in the Suez Canal Company. In 1875, he sold all of the stocks to the British, and the British took dual financial control. By 1879, they completely removed Ismail from power and appointed his son Tawfiq, who allowed for full British control of the Suez Canal Company and Egypt. This is Muhammad Ali and Ismail. Now, the other important thing about the British taking control is it really led to the birth and rise of radical Islamism and political Islam in Egypt. And it really was a progression from more modernization and peaceful liberation of Arab lands from European control, and it moved slowly but surely into revolutionary action and more violent extremism, a lot of which we are seeing today. The first thinker is the thinker in the middle, Sayyid Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. He was a Islamic modernist who really believed in pan-Islamic unity. He really advocated for a return to true Islam and using Islam to modernize Arab lands like Egypt. And he was fervently anti-British and anti-imperial forces. He was exiled from Egypt on multiple occasions because of this. But he was highly influential on the thinker to the left, Muhammad Abduh. Muhammad Abduh took Afghani's ideas on Islam and political Islam and really shaped it into more Islamic reformism, which is kind of a spin on modernism, more so using Islam within the government to reform the current systems and bring about more traditional Islamic leadership in the government. And after Muhammad Abduh came Hassan al-Banna, who is extremely important because he is the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is one of the most important Islamist organizations to ever exist. And Hassan al-Banna was really able to take the ideas of Abduh and Afghani and shift them into a more activist realm, into an advocacy organization, and he was open to using whatever means necessary, especially political violence and terror. The other important thinker is Sayyid Qutb. Qutb was initially an Egyptian nationalist. He was a poet and heavily involved in the literary scene. But by World War II, he was beginning to switch to Islamism. He was really disenchanted with nationalism due to World War II and the British reoccupying Egypt fully with the military. And with the formation of Israel in 1948, Qutb was fully disenchanted with any possibility of using peaceful means to save Arab lands. He really saw the formation of Israel as further Western domination of Arab lands. He also studied the American education system in Colorado for 2 years. And he wrote actually that, quote, "Nobody can compete with the Americans in building churches, yet despite all of this, no one is as distant as Americans from appreciating the spirituality and sanctity of religion." And he was fully convinced that America and the West were the propagators of Jahiliyyah, which is ignorance of divine commands in Arabic and the Quran. He would return to Egypt in 1950, and that is when we get to Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat. These two were founding leaders of the Free Officers Movement, which was an ideological coalition of military officers in the Egyptian army. There was socialism, Islamism, Marxism, various ideologies in the group. Nasser was an Arab nationalist and socialist. And in 1952, the Free Officers staged a coup d'etat against the government. And by 1953, Nasser had gained complete control of Egypt as a totalitarian Arab socialist leader. And by 1956, Nasser would nationalize the Suez Canal, which was very important. He fully rid the British from Egypt, and he became really a national hero and an international hero for the Arab world because of this. But the more important thing for our presentation is that he did a total repressive crackdown on the Islamist movement and Islam in Egypt as a whole. He wrote in 1955 that, quote, "Reactionary religious groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood are neither genuinely political nor genuinely religious. Their ultimate aim is power, and to realize it, they adopt measures contrary to the spirit of Islam and the spirit of the age." Now, Nasser would crack down very hard throughout his entire tenure, and this was fully realized in 1965 when Nasser arrested Said Qutb for treason, and Qutb was executed that same year. Qutb is quoted as saying, "Praise be to God, I performed jihad, or holy war, for 15 years until I earned this martyrdom." In 1970, Nasser would die, and he would be succeeded by his vice president, Anwar Sadat. Now, Anwar Sadat was a lot different than Nasser. He was an Egyptian nationalist rather than an Arab nationalist. He believed more in nation than the regionalism. He was also a Muslim, and he labeled himself the believer president, contrary to Nasser. He allowed for the full integration of Islam back into society and allowed for the release of all Muslim Brotherhood political prisoners. He also instituted a corrective revolution, which purged all Nasser-era officials and policies, and he started moving Egypt in a more free market capitalist way. By 1973, Sadat would invade Israel with other Arab nations in the Yom Kippur War. This was largely due to Nasser's Six-Day War in 1967, which ended terribly for Egypt. It ended in 6 days, shockingly. And the Yom Kippur War was really a way for Sadat to bring the U.S. and Israel to the negotiation table and establish economic and national security for Egypt. This is Sadat with Jimmy Carter and Menachem Begin at the Camp David Accords. The negotiations would last for many, many years, and they would climax in 1979, obviously, with the signing of the Accords. This was a very big deal because it was the first time that any Arab state had recognized Israeli sovereignty, which was a major deal. They both won the Nobel Peace Prize for this achievement. And actually, I'm going to stay on that. But with the Camp David Accords, there was a major blowback in Egypt from the Islamic community that had been freed and kind of liberated by Sadat. They saw this really as a betrayal, and Sadat as more of a puppet from the West, and mass revolts and civil strife really ensued. And this was really added on with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, where the Islamists there were successfully able to overthrow the Shah and install the Ayatollah Khomeini. The Islamists in Egypt were a lot more competent after this event because they saw it as a real possibility. The other important event here is the splintering of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1979, the same year. The Muslim Brotherhood denounced violence in 1979 as a way to maintain political legitimacy, and this led to a fracturing within the organization of more violent extremist factions. As you can see on there, I made kind of a graph. Al-Qaeda is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas today is kind of down that path of the fracturing. But the important one for what we're discussing is the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was founded by Muhammad Abdi al-Salam Faraj. He was a strict follower of Sayyid Qutb and a very extremist Islamist. He used Qutb's theory of jihad as more of a tool, and he wrote a pamphlet called The Neglected Duty, in which he assigned jihad and holy war as a neglected duty for Muslims to overthrow Egypt's Jahiliyyah and the ignorant leadership. And he specifically adopted a philosophy of tyrannicide, which is assassinating one's leader because they are a tyrant and ignoring the population. And historian Danny Orbach, he has a great article on this, but he really wrote that Qutb was the theoretician with more of a gloomy worldview, whereas Faraj was, the young activist with an optimistic worldview that by simply assassinating one's leader, that everything could change. At the same time, Sadat would turn to totalitarianism, like Nasser, to combat the rising Islamists and the civil disorder. He would claim power as both prime minister and president. He removed all term limits on his power, and he reversed a lot of the reforms put in place during the corrective revolution. He also passed a national law of shame in Egypt, which allowed for the regime to easily prosecute anyone that offended national values, whatever they defined as national values. And in 1981, Sadat would issue mass arrests against the radical Islamists, whether they truly were radical Islamists or not. One of them would be Muhammad al-Islambuli, who is brothers to Khalid al-Islambuli on the board. Khalid al-Islambuli was an officer in the Egyptian army and a member of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And he was a close friend of Faraj, and they would ultimately plot the assassination, which would take place on October 6th, 1981. And I put a revolutionary turning point in radical Islamism and the fate of the modern world on here, because Sadat's assassination really is a major turning point alongside the Iranian Islamic Revolution. in political Islam and radical Islamism in shaping world policy and revolting against the Western hegemony, which has affected the Arab world and the Middle East for many years. And as we're going to be talking about in the next talk on Hamas and Iran, it's extremely important for understanding the assassination and its implications in the modern world. Thank you very much.
Otherwise, if there are no questions, I would like you to once again give a hand to our presenters here.